Welcome to the This Week in Cleantech podcast. Each week we speak to a leading CEO, executive, thought leader or insider in the cleantech sector. Each guest shares their thoughts on recent events, their own cleantech story and their vision and hopes for the future. This week our host David Hunt is joined by Martijn Lopes Cardozo. Martijn is a Dutch entrepreneur and international executive. He spent several years in the US where he built and grew a number of technology companies, all of which had successful exits. He is now the CEO of circular economy company Black Bear Carbon, a company that upcycles end-of-life tyres to produce sustainable carbon black, preventing CO2 emissions and solving the global waste tyre problem. Earlier this week, Black Bear was selected as a Global Cleantech 100 company for the second year running. Before we start, a reminder that you can subscribe to the This Week in Cleantech podcast via iTunes or all of the other usual podcast platforms. That's enough from me. Let's hand it over to David with Martijn Lopes Cardozo.
Hello, Martijn. Thank you for joining us on the This Week in Cleantech podcast today. Firstly, you've got a very varied background across strategy, media, innovation, business, scale-ups. What led you in particular to the cleantech sector and more specifically to join Black Bear?
Well, thanks, David. Actually, it's a little bit of a longer story because my background is sort of physics. Then I sort of ventured in strategy consulting. I went to business school in the US. Was involved in the out of school in a number of startups, sort of in the wild 90s, sort of during the sort of dot-com boom and bust. So started a business with a group in Boston out of school, moved it to Hollywood because we were in the entertainment sector, had a really good ride, a couple success stories.
Yeah.
And subsequently so decided after about 10 years to venture back to the Netherlands. And I have to say, David, at that point, I felt pretty good, right? Sort of, a couple of successes under my belt, go back home, sort of catch up with my old friends in the Netherlands. And basically, I decided to sort of replicate my success here in Europe and in Holland in particular. So I actually started two business. Both of them, I have to say, failed miserably. Subsequently, I tried to, in the financial crisis, find a job. Finally, found one.
Right.
Got fired within a year. And to make things even worse, turned 40, and it was my midlife crisis right there.
We all have ones and a few stories to tell, but and again, it's good to be open and honest around, and I think that's key in entrepreneurship and in startups. The ride is never smooth, and I think every success somewhere behind is a failure. So it's good to be open about that. I kind of had some experience in the telecoms bubble back in end of the 90s into the early 2000s. What were the sort of learning points, I guess, that you bring forward from those experiences in the boom and bust and with the ventures which failed when you came back to Europe?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple lessons learned. I think maybe one generic lesson is that success and failure can be very close together, right? Sure. So I think in every business that has been a success, at some point it felt like a failure. So definitely there's an element of luck, and the odds are against you. So that's, I think, a more general comment. The other sort of key learning, and it's more personal learning, is I think that being successful is also very what I call contextual. So being successful in one space, in one geography, in a certain setting, and trying to replicate that somewhere else in a different environment is not a recipe for success. Mm-hmm. So I think a good entrepreneur always very much adapts to sort of local circumstances of the sector, and doesn't take success for granted.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, actually, I was going to touch on. We have, with the Hyperion business, a number of Dutch clients, actually, and many from across Europe, but we're very active in the US. In fact, I was in New York recently for a week to meet with some clients and investors. But do you think that there was more of a surprise or to you that there were differences from building those businesses in the US to coming back to Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's massive differences. I mean, the businesses we originally built in the US were very much on the sort of media, internet, interactive TV, mobile side. And for instance, if you take the TV market and compare the US with the Netherlands, there's sort of 300 plus channels in the US. In the Netherlands, there are like 5. The size of the market is very, very much different.
Yeah.
So there's sort of some clear elements that have to do with market size and scope, but also I think in the way you do business. So my approach really was at that point in time, find the best people available in the industry, raise a lot of money, and go all out. And what I found is that a lot of the businesses, at least in the Netherlands at the time, were much more sort of organically formed. So somebody has a job, finds out there's an issue, tries to maybe sort of do something about it in their current position, and then after a year quits his job, has a nephew who builds a site, and then gets some customers, and then after a couple of years in, raises some money. So it's a very different dynamic. So in hindsight, sort of I think people thought was probably sort of overly aggressive in the way I approached it, raising money without didn't have much more than a stack of slides to show. And I think that's a very different way that a lot of European business have been set up.
Sure. No, that's interesting insights. We'll move on shortly to the circular economy and specifically to Black Bear Carbon. But going back to that, coming back to Europe, as you say, having a couple of failures, even taking up a job and that not panning out. Obviously, a lot happened in the financial crisis. But what led you specifically to the broader sort of clean tech and to Black Bear? Was there some driver? Was it an accident or design?
It's always hard. It's accident or design, but so basically, when I reached 40 and sort of without a job, I basically decided to take some time off and joined my university, or not sort of as a sort of volunteer in one of their tech incubators called TU Delft. There's at that point, there were about 30 companies. I think it's now grown to 150, and quite a bit of clean tech entrepreneurs, a lot of students sort of straight out of school or PhDs with a research topic. And basically just decided to sort of help those companies, grow and scale. And so what I realized is that sort of I found it very inspiring to sort of combine entrepreneurship with purpose. And at the same time, going back to my sort of childhood days, sort of the moments I was most happy and I was most passionate were the times I spent in nature. So, for me, purpose really was, how to preserve the planet. And, I think the biggest crisis we're having is the climate crisis.
Yeah.
So then I really started to zoom in on ways to, companies that would have a big sort of CO2 savings potential. And I guess sort of I helped about 100 clean tech companies in various shapes or forms. And, when sort of I also got approached by Black Bear, who at that point was in the laboratory phase, I thought it basically checked all the boxes. So it had big potential, was scalable, the business model was attractive. I liked the team. So basically, I helped them out for about half a year, and then they recruited me as their CEO.
Cool. Okay. I think clearly, as you say, climate is fortunately becoming a fairly big topic, perhaps not big enough. And the circular economy as part of that is clearly making some traction. It provides an enormous opportunity to solve some of the world's biggest issues, and of course to build sustainable, profitable businesses and to create jobs. Certainly in the last couple of years, single-use plastic has taken a lot of the headlines, and rightly so in many regards. But can you tell us a little bit about the problem that Black Bear Carbon addresses?
Sure. So basically, Black Bear solves two big problems at the same time. So the first problem is the global waste tire problem. So each year, there's more than 1.5 billion tires that reach the end of their life. So that's sort of a massive amount.
Mm-hmm.
If you look what happens with those tires, sort of 70% gets burned.
Wow.
There's still some landfill. There is in tropical regions. It's a big source of diseases like malaria because mosquitoes breed in the rims of the tire.
Okay.
And there's no really good other applications. I mean, there's a little bit of asphalt, but there's no high-end applications for the tire. So that's basically issue number one. The issue number two is if you just look at the production of tires, it's mostly fossil-based. So you have steel, you have rubber, and you have carbon black. And the carbon black is actually not the most well-known component, but it's a big component of the tire, about 30%. And it's made from oil. It's basically a black powder.
Okay.
And it takes about 2.5 liters of crude oil to create 1 kilo of product with a lot of pollution and CO2 emissions. So if you look at those two problems, then you basically are able to take the materials out of the tires in a way that they can be reused for new tires. So the steel, the rubber, and the carbon black. You basically solve two problems at the same time. So you solve the global waste tire problem, and at the same time, you also help make the tire less fossil-based and less polluting. So that's what we're out to do.
Okay. As you say, it's a monumental problem. We sometimes it's easy to skip past these things, and when we obviously there's a lot of focus at the moment on e-mobility, which is something we're very active in, and sort of the mobility transition. But one thing is consistent, regardless of the powertrain, is the tire, I guess. So but that's a phenomenal amount. 1.5 billion tires a year coming to the end of life, and as you say, we all see them from time to time on the side of the road. I know there are some who chop them to make sort of soft surfaces for children's playgrounds, but it's a huge problem. So do you have sort of proprietary technical capabilities in order to extract the black carbon back from the sort of old tires?
Yeah, absolutely. So the team basically has worked in the laboratory for a couple of years to solve that issue, and of course we have sort of patented all of that. And at this point, we're the only company that can really extract the carbon black at such a high quality that it can replace the virgin material. And that's actually, I think, in general, the biggest challenge of the circular economy.
Yeah.
Is if you can always downcycle and make something, soles of shoes or something else from end-of-life tires. So I think the critical thing is in the circular economy is how you can get the materials that you harvest at such a high quality level so it can be reused back in the original applications. So in our case, that would be tires, right, which is quite logical. But carbon black is also used for a lot of rubber products, but also used for ink, for paint, for coatings, plastic. So basically everything that is black around you uses carbon black.
So it's an enormous opportunity. I guess the question comes around the business model. I've seen on the website, and we'll share with the podcast the video of from the website in terms of the production facility. But is your business model to sort of own, operate, manage, and build upcycling plants, or to license the technology to others, or what's the sort of the plan from here in terms of scaling up?
So all of the above. So I think, initially with these type of technology, it's not like software that you can just sort of, build and distribute and license. So you really have to showcase it.
Yeah.
So what we did is we basically built together with the largest tire collector, the first, industrial scale prototype factory. So this is really, it can handle about 1 million tires annually. So it's really, commercial industrial scale.
Yeah.
But, there's enough tires to build over 1,500 of these production lines. So, of course, have to find a clever way to roll them out. But you for sure have to prove the technology and, own and operate at least 1 or 2 installations yourself before it becomes proven technology that can be licensed out.
Okay. And at the moment, clearly based in the Netherlands, have you international? Obviously, the problem is global, but at what point do you see Black Bear Carbon sort of spreading its wings overseas?
Yeah, so we raised a larger 16 million round in the fall to do exactly that. So we, first basically went through 3 phases. So initially we figured it out how it works in the lab. Then we showed it could be done at scale by, renting out production facilities in Germany.
Right.
Then we built a factory ourselves together with Cargo, the largest tire recycler in the Benelux. Then we debottlenecked the factory, which, new technologies and factories always, there's a lot of learnings.
Yeah.
And we can talk a little bit more about that later. So the next step, of course, is to replicate that. So we're now working on, several sort of projects, which will be about 35 million euro in capex, and we're sort of have about 10 projects in development right now at different stages.
Right.
And there will be your sort of, or second generation technology that we'll be implementing.
Sure. Okay. I think one of the things you touched on right at the very beginning was in terms of the fundraising. When the time is right, and of course, what is the best way to do so? 60 million euros is a reasonable funding. Was that seed or Series A? But how did you? What has your experience been in fundraising, where you have an IP, you clearly have a technology that solves a problem, but of course, as with most things from the lab, there's still much proving to be done. How did you find the fundraising?
Yeah, actually, I found it quite interesting and very different from, of course, the West Coast environment in the internet and the software world.
Yeah.
So one of the things I've witnessed while actually was doing helping a lot of the clean tech companies at the TU Delft incubator scale is if there's an infrastructure component, investors are always worried about sort of putting money in if they don't know who's going to finance the infrastructure at the later stage.
Yeah.
So you're in there in the lab, you've proven it, you have sort of, customers who have sampled it, and they go like, well, if I put a couple million in, who's going to finance the next 10 or 20 million in infrastructure capital? Because we don't want to do that. So one of the decisions we did early on is actually to finance the first factory first. Using project finance, so bank loans from reputable banks like the Rabobank.
Okay.
And formed a joint venture with a tire collector, so you're embedded in the value chain. And we then raised or seed or Series A or whatever you want to call it, so after we had secured the financing for our first project.
Okay.
And that's sort of, science. If I talk to my West Coast friends, they say that's not logical, right? So that you raise money for the infrastructure before you do it for the technology. But larger tickets are scarce, and my experience has been, maybe it's changing now, that VC investors do not want to fund infrastructure with equity.
Yeah.
So we basically did the other way around. We did the sort of debt financing for the project finance first, and then on the back of that, we raised equity from VC.
Yeah, I guess that's a little of a different way around, trying to, I should say, raise project finance or to create or build a project with still yet unproven, certainly at scale, technology. So it's good that you found banks that were willing to do that and saw the opportunity. I think as an entrepreneur, it's always interesting to see at which point where you can use debt, where you can use, or at what point you need to share equity. Again, without going into any sort of specifics or confidential information, but is the company still owned by the founding partners, or was there some equity disclosed or shared out during the fundraise so far?
No, absolutely. So we've done a number of rounds. So initially, the first couple of years, it was self-funded by management. And after sort of about 4 years ago, after we raised the 3 years ago, after we raised the project finance, we raised a couple million in venture money, and also got the first institutional venture capitalist in. And then we did, after we sort of reached the next proof point, which was basically, the factory was producing high quality carbon black. We had sort of a number of paying customers, including, the likes of AkzoNobel. Mm-hmm. That's when we raised the larger 16 million round. And we basically put a pretty big consortium together, with investors who could bring, different elements that we needed for scaling.
Okay. And I should say slightly more complex from a funding perspective, but again, we're talking about a technology. I know you touched on you having a sort of a physics background, but what have been some of the challenges from a technical point of view in coming out from the lab into large industrial scale, and sort of as a CEO balancing the needs for funding and finance with the technical capabilities of the solution? What have been some of the challenges in scaling from a technical and from a product point of view?
Yeah, it's actually a very good question. And I have to say my physics background has partially helped there. But what I found is that, it's partially science, but it's also a lot of sort of knowledge that is on the factory floor, and is, more art than science. In the sort of process-related areas. So I think the biggest challenge when we went from the lab, we did a step in between. So as opposed to building a pilot factory, we basically did tests in Germany on industrial scale equipment. And then, we built our first industrial scale prototype factory. So actually fairly quickly after we had completed the factory, we were able to produce high quality product. So actually that went really well. And, we shipped that to customers, and the quality was actually even better than expected.
Right, okay.
So, we definitely had a bottle of champagne there at the same time. What happened is after we ran for a couple of hours, we had a lot of clogging, a lot of fouling, dust. So we were on a rhythm where we produced maybe for a couple of hours in a day, and then had to clean for a week, which is, of course, not very good for your economics of your factory, as you can imagine.
Sure. And these are challenges that you've been able to overcome, or are still in the process of overcoming?
Yeah, so it's actually interesting, how infrastructure clean tech play differs from software. Because in my old days, what I did is you bought a case of Red Bulls, and then put everybody said we're going to do an overnight sprint and then do a sort of new launch the next day. Whereas here, the cost of iterations are way more expensive.
Yeah.
So it's actually a good lesson in terms of how you approach something like that, because your first gut is, you want to advisor is actually the sort of old CEO of Shell, who sort of ran big manufacturing plants here in the Netherlands, actually the biggest refinery at that point. Basically said, sort of, don't do that, right? Sort of really take your time for data gathering.
Mm-hmm.
Although it's very frustrating, right? You basically run for a couple of hours and clean for a week. Keep doing that for at least as an extended period, and learn, capture data, and really do your analysis. So based on that data set, we sort of put together a team of sort of experts from inside, but also from outside of the company. So we worked actually closely with Fluor, who's a big, Fortune 500 contractor with a lot of experience in the oil and gas field.
Yeah.
And that's basically where our biggest issues were. So basically, in our process, the gas evaporates. And that sort of should condense at the right point in time, but it condensed way too early. So based on the data set, the team of experts, we started sort of thinking about solutions and really trying to validate the solutions with data. And once we had done that, sort of maybe half a year later, that we basically closed the factory and did a big revamp. And I have to say, most of the issues were addressed pretty well. So, not 100% perfect, but we did address the major items. And we are able to run, basically running a couple days in a row, and then sort of do a short stop and start again. So, the problem has been solved.
Making good progress. So what does in an ideal world, what does the next couple of years look like for Black Bear Carbon? What are the biggest sort of challenges and opportunities that you see ahead for the next couple of years?
Yeah, so if you look where we are, is we've validated technology, we've proven the product market fit with over 10 companies as repeat buyers in all market segments, with over 150 companies now who have basically approved our product, which is going to be quite a lengthy process. And there's a lot of end-of-life tires available. So our biggest challenge really is, how do we scale this fast? And that sort of keeps me awake at night. How can you do that most efficiently?
Yep.
So we're so what we're doing anyway, which makes a lot of sense, is sort of building our next 35 million project. We needed to do that. So that's sort of a no regret. But after that, there's, different options, what you could do. Because, we've worked very closely with the, existing value chain, customers, and sort of, license the technology or partner with them for rapid scale out.
Right.
Another way to do it is, if you look what happens in the wind and solar, is deploy larger pools of infrastructure capital to accelerate the rollout. So, don't finance plants one at a time, but raise $1 billion and build, 10, 20 at a time, and really sort of take a modular approach. So very much like what happened in the wind industry.
Yeah.
Drive down costs, improve your learning rate, sort of as a technology licensing play. So there's really different strategic options at that point that we're all exploring.
Okay. And again, as you say, it's nice when you're making new ground, but I would have thought, as doesn't appear there's a huge amount of competition to date and a big problem to solve, that there are a lot of partners or opportunities for licensing. It'll be interesting to see which come around most quickly. I have a personal and a sort of professional passion for scaling of clean tech companies, both mine and those I work with as clients, particularly building teams and cultures that work. And I know this is something you've touched on, and from reading some of your content is important to you. So how have you gone about building your team and sort of defining the company culture in this particular instance?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. And something that I believe is really key in building your teams. So I think if you look at the sort of the original group of sort of management and early founders, was really sort of a very experienced team. So a lot of people had have done fine building factories or engineering at many times before.
Yeah.
And I think what that did was actually a number of things. First of all, I think we were able, because of that, we're able to attract exceptional talent very early. So when we had no funding or very little funding and not a lot to show for, we were still able, because of the experience of the team, acquire really top talent.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think that was really, really helpful. And then I think the other thing that was helpful is both internally but also externally, really telling the story and doing a lot of storytelling around the why of our company, and making it truly purpose driven entity, which in turn helped attract talent.
Yeah.
But also when things were not happily coasting along, and we had a lot of struggles and issues, people did see the bigger picture and felt like we're here's why we're doing it, and this is our goal, and this is our mission, and this is why we're so passionate about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was quite critical. And then there's sort of a lot of mechanic things, and I'm arguing we could sort of do much better on a lot of these dimensions, but we have our weekly sort of huddles, get-togethers, and offsites, and what have you, and they will become increasingly important as the company grows.
Yeah, yeah. How have you found, given that you've experienced a number of entrepreneurial or startup businesses, both clean tech and software, and on both sides of the Atlantic? I think that's one of the key things, the reason that we love and get involved in exclusively in the clean tech sector, is that element of purpose and passion. In recruiting, I know some people feel that you have to be dishing away equity or sort of golden welcomes, and of course in some instances they're attractive, but I think the key thing you touched on there was telling the story and having a first-class team that people can buy into and join. It's a challenge to do, though. Of course, you're almost working in reverse. You're creating something before it exists from a personnel point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. And but I find it fascinating that actually, I think what we're seeing now is the young people who are either straight out of school, or sort of our ideal target are people who are sort of 3 to 5 years in, who have worked and learned a certain skill set, really want to sort of find a purpose driven company as their next sort of career step.
Yeah.
And then the other pool we're tapping into is the people who had a distinguished career, and are anywhere sort of mid-50s, don't want to go back to a corporate job, not that worried about financials, and really want to sort of have a big impact to tell their grandchildren what they did in life.
Yeah, no, for sure.
As an example, so we recently recruited a CFO who used to run a big waste group in the Netherlands with a couple of thousand people, and he's now sort of joining a 2-people finance team. So, but you of course recruit those people not for what the company is now, but what the company could be in a couple of years.
Sure. Yeah. And I think sometimes it's easy for us in the clean tech sector to becoming a little bit in a bubble. Obviously, it's what we believe in. It's what we do day in, day out. But it's good to see that people from outside sectors, and we often have people from oil and gas and from sort of traditional energy and traditional manufacturing and automotive sectors who are very keen to get involved in something with a little more purpose and with something a little more that you can get out of bed for more than the paycheck, which is really really great to see.
Yeah, so in talking about culture, I think there's sort of 2 other things that come to mind, and one is celebrate your wins, and sometimes they're sort of far and few between, and often also a win has, for instance, yes, we produced sort of, a lot of big run. However, quality was not good, right? So it's very easy then to say, well, let's not celebrate it.
Right.
And I think it's very, very critical to sort of just isolate the wins and just celebrate those without caveats or, immediately focusing on what's next, but really pausing and taking the time to celebrate it and share that success and put the people who contributed to that success in the limelight. And that sounds easy, but it's hard because a lot of the CEOs and entrepreneurs are always impatient and they always go directly to the next thing, and that's very demotivational. So that would be one. The other thing is we have in our weekly session we always list the successes, but also the failures of the week. And if there's no failures, I basically challenge the team and saying, if we're not failing, we're not trying hard enough.
Yeah.
Because I really want to have those failures be open, out there, and acceptable. So we had really funny stories, like somebody, the system was all clogged up, and then some guys went in there with torches and then tried to find the fouling and cleaned it and closed everything and then started up again, and the system didn't work, and then some guy said, I thought we had 2 torches. So it's very easy to not talk about that, and if you make that sort of acceptable, you get all the issues on the table, and once you have all the issues on the table, there's typically solutions. The problem where it goes wrong is if people put things under the rug, don't want to communicate, and then it blows up in your face.
Sure. I think that's a cultural thing, which is vitally important. I think it's WeWork actually, or maybe it was just some businesses in one of the WeWorks that I had some involvement with, was have a failure wall, where again people put up a post-it note and this is where I messed up this week, and then they have a sort of relatively light-hearted team discussion around okay, what can we have done differently, or what can we learn from this? And I think those are the critical things: is taking the time out to learn. When things are so fast-paced, and you, as you say, you're always wanting to move on to the next project or the next phase of the business, but taking that time out to step back and almost reward failure in the sense of, as long as there's a learning opportunity from that, and that's difficult in a small team. Have you had experience of trying to maintain that as teams scaled from 2 to 20 to 200?
So the company we had in the West Coast was about 100 people before it was sold. And of course, the trick there is you cannot do everything all together anymore. And so what really becomes important, that the leaders of the different teams within your organization basically adopt those practices within their own teams.
Right.
And that's, of course, a challenge. My hope, of course, is that by doing it centrally for a while, things will happen in different places. But it's hard, right? Especially if you double in size and a lot of new people, you always have the risk of culture changing very rapidly.
Yeah, that's always a challenge.
I don't have a secret sauce for you there, David, except for the general over communicate and hire for culture and all the things you can read in your textbook. But I find it incredibly hard. Yeah,
it is a challenge, but I think it's also to reiterate, as we do with our clients and from learning from ourselves, it's nothing necessarily is rocket science, but if you learn from other people's mistakes and learn from your own and have a culture of doing so, then you're on a good path. So you've obviously, as you say, been an experienced entrepreneur, both sides of the Atlantic. You've been in software and media where things perhaps happen more quickly and are more or less infrastructure based, and now you've got an infrastructure background as well. What are your, I guess, which have given you the most headaches and the most exhilaration, and what have you enjoyed or learned over the sort of the variety of startup experiences you had?
Yeah, it's actually good. It's actually a good question, and one of the things I have to keep telling myself is also enjoy the ride. What I've witnessed myself is that, typically if you're in the middle of it, you don't take time to enjoy it enough. And one of the things that has helped me, but I think it's sort of a personal thing, because I'm speaking to other entrepreneurs, they at the end they have a good exit or the company goes public or something like that, and then they look back and say, oh, what a fantastic ride. If you ask them in the middle, they're pretty stressed and pressured. So one of the things that has helped me is to, as I took the role of CEO, really take the time to also be the evangelist, and ideally not just for the company, but also a bit for the sector. So I joined the board of a group called Circle Economy, which really is out there to make sure there's sort of practical and scalable solutions for the industry. Make sure you're not just giving company presentations, but all more generic TEDx talks and things like that. And that sort of gives you a different vantage point, because you're suddenly putting things in a bigger perspective, and you're also are able to share the story, and the reaction you get from other people is like, well, it's pretty amazing what you guys are doing. And sometimes you need other people to tell you, because if you're in the middle, it doesn't feel that way.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. As you say, sometimes it's head down, next thing, and it's good to recognize the successes and to enjoy the fun, because we all know that there's plenty of challenges, and as we suggested earlier, fair few scars you earn along the way. But equally, it's good to maximize the upside. So finally, I tend to ask people about sort of books that have been influential or had impact. Funnily enough, when you were just talking there, one of the books I read recently was Matthew Syed and Black Box Thinking, which was around sort of systems and processes and open learning cultures, which was great. For yourself, any particular book or over the last year or so that's had most impact on you?
Yeah, so interestingly, I don't read a lot of sort of business books. What I really like to read is sort of more historical biographies. I think the last one I did was I think there's one on Edison by Walter Isaacson.
Okay.
The one who also wrote the one on Steve Jobs, which I read as well. And what I like about that is that it's sort of, because it's, a while ago and it's very well researched, it really gives the sort of full picture of how things evolved. And how luck played into it, and very different from, of course, what you read about sort of the very recent successes where you get much more the PR story. And I find it fascinating because I think at that time they were going through similar sort of revolutions with discovery of the light, or Einstein was another good one with the quantum theory. And how those things got adopted, and what sort of forces worked in favor, and so I find it very very intriguing, and that then triggers my thinking on sort of where are we now, the bigger cycle, and what's going to happen next, and how should we position ourselves.
Sure. No, thanks for sharing that. Again, I think biographies are fascinating, and you can learn a lot from. Recently, I've read everything from Schwarzenegger to Warren Buffett. So I think it's good to hear and learn from.
If they're well documented, right? So there's some of them that are read a little bit as PR stories, like I think the one I wrote on Elon Musk, but the ones where people are really did the research and sort of it gives the full 360. Like the one I think on Steve Jobs. I mean, there was not, wasn't all positive about him for sure.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, listen, Martijn, it's been great for you to share some of your experiences and insight for the podcast. Thank you for joining us. To close out, are there any particular final, I should say, no magic sauce necessarily, but any final words of wisdom for those who are either embarking on or at the very early stages of a clean tech startup?
Yeah. So I think you mentioned sort of circular economy and climate. So I think it's still a very much under resourced opportunity. So I think if you look at the sort of renewable industry, I think that industry is really starting to mature. But it has a factor 100, maybe 1,000 in terms of its investment. Whereas if you look at the CO2 savings potential of the circular economy, it's roughly half of what we can achieve what we need for the COP21 Paris goals.
Right.
And there's still very little happening at scale. So I actually met some of the early infrastructure pioneers on the offshore wind category, and they're now actually really going aggressively into the circular economy because they feel that's where the big impact and returns will be.
Yeah.
So I think watch that space. I think we're just in one small sector. I think plastics is now leading the way, but I think we'll hear a lot about this category.
For sure. Yeah, it's certainly one that we're active and watching very closely. Thanks again for your time this morning, Martijn. I wish you every success with the future of Black Bear Carbon. We'll be looking to see how things progress, and thank you again for your time.
Well, thanks a lot, David. I enjoyed the interview.
Thank you for joining us again on the This Week in Clean Tech podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if so, please do share it with friends, colleagues, and on any social media platforms. It really does help us out, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one.